Under a pale dawn sky in April 1946, the barbed wire fences of a prisoner camp in the American zone of Germany trembled in the morning wind. Inside, hundreds of women, former auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, nurses, radio operators, and clerks, stood in tense silence as U.S. Army trucks idled nearby. Their release papers had been signed. After years of captivity, they were free to go home. But a strange thing happened that morning. Many of them refused to leave. The guards were bewildered. Freedom, after all, was supposed to be what every prisoner longed for. Yet the women clutched their meager belongings, staring at the gates not with joy, but fear. To the officers overseeing the process, it seemed impossible. Why would these women, who had survived the collapse of the Third Reich, now hesitate to walk into their own homeland? The answer would reveal one of the war's most haunting paradoxes, that sometimes the idea of home is far more terrifying than captivity itself. A few years earlier, these same women had stood behind radio consoles, telegraph wires, and field hospitals across occupied Europe. They were the unseen infrastructure of Hitler's war machine, trained to obey, record, and serve. Most were barely out of their teens when drafted into auxiliary service. By 1945, as Allied forces closed in, many were captured amid the chaos. Their roles were clerical, not combative, yet to the victors, the distinction blurred. The Allies processed them as prisoners of war, placing them in segregated camps across France, Britain, and the U.S. For many, the journey across the Atlantic was their first glimpse of the wider world. The voyage from Europe to America carried them from the ashes of totalitarianism into a strange calm. They arrived not to chains or brutality, but to well-run camps, places that, while fenced and guarded, offered steady food, education, and even dignity. The American approach to POWs, rooted in the Geneva Convention and moral display, contrasted sharply with the retribution sweeping through post-war Europe. Here, even their captors seemed uncertain how to treat them, as enemies or as victims of a regime that had already devoured its own people. Inside those camps, the routine became their refuge. They learned English, helped in camp kitchens, and even worked on nearby farms under supervision. American guards, many of them young draftees themselves, treated the women not with hatred, but with an awkward sense of compassion. Letters home were censored, but still allowed. Newspapers circulated freely. They listened to American radio music, soft jazz, the Andrews Sisters, and the hum of a culture untouched by ruin. Slowly, they began to adapt. Some even smiled again. Meanwhile, Europe was changing beyond recognition. Germany's cities were uninhabitable, its rail lines broken, and its economy erased. The women's families, if alive, were struggling in ruins. When word arrived of Soviet occupation zones and the reports of mass assaults, fear spread through the camp like fire. Many of these women came from eastern towns, Königsberg, Breslau, Danzig, places that no longer existed under their old names. The home, to which they were told to return, was now foreign soil, governed by those they had been taught to fear. One of the American officers, a major from Ohio, later recalled how disbelief turned to moral confusion. "We expected tears of joy," he said, "but they just stood there. Some even begged us not to send them back." For the first time, the U.S. Army faced a phenomenon it had not anticipated. Prisoners pleading not for freedom, but for indefinite captivity. At first, the requests seemed isolated. A handful of women asked to remain as translators or helpers. But soon, the camp offices were overwhelmed with petitions, dozens, then hundreds, signed with trembling hands. "Please," they wrote, "do not send me home." The reasons varied. Some had no family left. Others feared Soviet occupation or retribution from neighbors who saw all returning Germans as complicit in war crimes. A few simply admitted that, within the camp, they had found stability for the first time in years. The American authorities didn't know how to respond. The war had ended. Repatriation was mandatory under international law. Keeping the women indefinitely would invite diplomatic complications. Yet sending them into devastation felt inhumane. Officers debated late into the night. To some, it was a bureaucratic problem. To others, it was a moral crisis, proof that the war's psychological toll had stripped away even the meaning of freedom. In the following weeks, the situation deepened. When the first transport convoys were announced, dozens of women hid in storerooms or feigned illness. Some tried to sabotage the paperwork by swapping identity numbers. Guards found one woman crouched beneath a Baroque floorboard, clutching a worn English phrasebook. She sobbed when discovered, not from fear of punishment, but because she knew she would be sent away. For her, America's fences had become safer than Germany's open roads. Reporters who visited the camp wrote cautiously about strange affections between captor and captive. But the truth was more profound. These women had witnessed humanity in their supposed enemies and horror in their own homeland. To them, America was not a prison but an island of order in a collapsing world. Even the guards, many of whom returned from battlefronts hardened by death, felt the contradiction gnawing at them. What did it mean when your enemy begged to stay under your protection? By summer 1946, the camp's gates finally opened for the repatriation trains. Some women went quietly. Others wept, clutching gifts from guards, scarves, small Bibles, and folded notes. As the trucks rumbled out toward the docks, an eerie silence settled over the compound. The guards stood motionless, watching the convoys vanish in the dust. Later, one sergeant would write in his journal that he'd never felt such guilt in uniform. "We were sending them away from safety," he wrote, "into a place called peace that didn't yet exist." Not all of them disappeared into the ruins. A handful, nurses, translators, and skilled typists, were granted temporary extensions to serve in U.S. military hospitals in Germany. Their competence made them indispensable. A few even married American soldiers after the formal end of captivity, bridging two worlds that had been taught to hate each other. Yet for most, the separation was final. Within weeks, the camps were empty, the fences taken down, and the signs removed. But the mystery lingered. Why had so many refused freedom? Historians would later call it the plea of the POW women, a brief but unsettling chapter in post-war reconciliation. It wasn't about loyalty to America or betrayal of Germany. It was about fear, displacement, and the shattering of identity. For those women, captivity had become the only structure left after a civilization's collapse. And as the last truck left the compound that summer, one woman turned back and whispered to a guard through the dust, "I was freer here than I'll ever be again." The Americans never forgot those words. They would echo in after-action reports, memoirs, and late-night recollections long after the war had ended. For the soldiers who heard them, it was a reminder that victory had its shadows, and that sometimes, even freedom can terrify the broken. The story of why those women refused to leave would only deepen in the months that followed, as Allied investigators uncovered what awaited them beyond the wire, where peace was far from merciful. In the months after those women reluctantly departed the camps, the U.S. Army began piecing together reports from the occupied zones. The picture was grim. Germany was no longer a nation. It was a shattered map stitched together by conquerors. For zones, for armies, for visions of what peace should look like. The American sector was stable but tense. The French were harsh, the British pragmatic, and the Soviet zone, where many of the repatriated women were headed, had descended into a nightmare. For some, returning home meant stepping directly into hunger, chaos, and vengeance. The plea of the POW women, as it came to be known among military administrators, drew attention from American command in Frankfurt and Washington. Reports described unusual reluctance to repatriate among German female auxiliaries. What they discovered wasn't ideological sympathy or disloyalty, it was raw survival instinct. For these women, the lines between punishment and protection had blurred. The world beyond the barbed wire no longer offered meaning to understand why. Investigators began tracing the lives these women had led before and during the war. Many had served in the Luftwaffe Helferinnenkorps, young women recruited as clerks, telephonists, and radar assistants. Their work had been technical, disciplined, and essential. They plotted bomber paths, tracked aircraft on cathode tubes, and managed encrypted communication lines. The German military machine, for all its brutality, had depended on their precision. But with defeat came erasure. Their skills were no longer seen as assets, but as stains, marks of collaboration with a regime now universally condemned. Technically, these women had operated some of the most advanced wartime equipment of their era. The Würzburg radar units they manned could track aircraft up to 40 kilometers away, feeding coordinates to anti-aircraft batteries with frightening accuracy. Their headphones crackled with coded commands, frequencies calibrated by engineers like Rudolf Kuhnhold and Hans Hallmann, pioneers of microwave physics whose innovations had once given the Reich a fleeting edge. When the war ended, those same frequencies fell silent, replaced by the static of occupation broadcasts. The women who once managed that invisible web of power were stripped of purpose overnight. In contrast, the Americans who guarded them represented an entirely different technological order. Their war had been fought with logistics, convoys, radios, engines, and the steady rhythm of supply. To the German women, the American military seemed mechanical yet humane, a vast system that functioned through discipline rather than ideology. The prisoners had lived within that machine, fed by it, protected by its rules. For a generation raised on obedience, the structure was familiar. Only this time, it was benevolent. Among the reports filed from Camp Rustin and Fort Oglethorpe, one detail appeared again and again: the women's fascination with American order. They admired the fairness of rations, the predictability of schedules, and the courtesy, even the paperwork. To them, it wasn't just material comfort. It was moral structure. Outside, Germany's ruins were lawless. Inside, even captivity had rules that made sense. It was, in a strange way, civilization. Then came the testimonies from the repatriation trains. Women who had boarded those convoys under guard were now being interviewed in the American sector, describing what awaited them beyond the wire. Soviet soldiers occupying Silesia and Pomerania saw returning Germans, especially those in uniform, as spoils of war. Some were assaulted. Others vanished into labor camps. Those who reached western zones found hostility from their own people. To many Germans, the returning auxiliaries represented the moral rot of the old regime. They were shunned, spat on, and denied ration cards. Freedom, for them, was starvation and stigma. By autumn 1946. American chaplains and social officers were recording case after case of repatriated women attempting to return to U.S. custody voluntarily. A few walked miles across ruined roads, hoping to find the same fences that once held them safe. Of course, regulations forbade readmission. The guards could only turn them away. But the image haunted them: former prisoners, now homeless civilians, begging to be locked up again. Meanwhile, within the U.S. military bureaucracy, the debate turned technical. Could these women be legally retained under a different classification, say, displaced persons under protective custody? The idea briefly surfaced but was rejected. America had neither the political will nor the administrative machinery to shelter former enemy nationals indefinitely. The Geneva Convention was clear: POWs must be returned once hostilities cease. Yet in practice, the spirit of that rule felt cruelly inverted. The paperwork of freedom condemned them more effectively than any prison sentence. Some of the American personnel who had worked closely with the women tried to intervene unofficially. A sergeant from Texas arranged for one of them, a 24-year-old telegrapher named Gerda, to take up clerical work in a Red Cross depot in Frankfurt. Another officer quietly married a former nurse to keep her in the U.S. zone. Small acts of defiance against a system that didn't know how to handle mercy. But most cases ended with deportation orders stamped and filed, the signatures neat and final. As months passed, U.S. intelligence began examining another dimension of the phenomenon: psychology. Military psychiatrists interviewed returning POWs to study adjustment failures. Their conclusions were chilling. After years of indoctrination, collapse, captivity, and uncertainty, many Germans, especially women, had lost what psychologists called Zielbewusstsein, the sense of purpose. Captivity, paradoxically, had replaced ideology with order. Freedom, in contrast, offered only chaos. The women's refusal to leave thus became a symbol of a deeper wound: how modern war, industrialized and total, could fracture identity itself. The German auxiliaries had lived within machines: typewriters, radar scopes, and encryption transmitters. Their lives were bound to systems of control. When those systems vanished, they no longer knew who they were. In American camps, those systems returned in gentler form: schedules, authority, fairness. It wasn't liberty they feared losing. It was structured, Across occupied Germany, Allied reconstruction teams were learning the same lesson on a grander scale. When order is destroyed, even tyranny can be missed. The women's plea foreshadowed the larger crisis soon to come: the division of Germany, the refugee floods, and the Iron Curtain descending across Europe. In their fear, one could glimpse the future of a continent about to split in two WWII winter. As the last camps closed, an officer compiling the final report added a note in the margin: some detainees asked to be allowed to remain under U.S. supervision indefinitely. Their requests were denied. Psychological state consistent with trauma and dependency. It was a dry line in a bureaucratic file, but behind it lay hundreds of lives suspended between worlds, and somewhere among those files were the names of the women who had once begged to stay, names that would soon be lost in the tide of post-war reconstruction. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, their story remained unforgettable. The same men who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes now realized that victory carried burdens no medal could erase. The paradox deepened as one more truth emerged. The Americans themselves were changing. Their contact with these former enemies, these frightened, articulate, disciplined women, challenged the easy moral binaries of war. For many soldiers, the experience marked the first time they questioned what liberation truly meant. WWII early 1947. As Europe's ruins hardened into borders, whispers spread among U.S. personnel that somewhere, in small American-run hospitals and supply depots, a few of those women still worked quietly under assumed names, never repatriated, never recorded. It was never proven. Perhaps it didn't need to be. The myth captured what the paperwork could not: the idea that compassion had occasionally outwitted policy, but the world was moving on. The Marshall Plan was taking shape, the Cold War stirring, and the psychological experiments of captivity would soon be buried beneath newer crises. Yet the haunting question remained, lingering like smoke from a fire long extinguished. How could people who had served tyranny come to fear freedom more than imprisonment? The answer would not be found in any archive. It lived instead in the faces of those women, staring through the wire, unable to step beyond it. And soon, that paradox between order and liberty, fear and belonging, would echo far beyond the camps, shaping how nations rebuilt themselves from moral ruins. But before that transformation took hold, one last revelation awaited: proof that the plea of the POW women had reached not just the soldiers and administrators, but the very architects of post-war Europe themselves, in 1947. As the embers of war cooled into the tense quiet of occupation, Allied administrators faced an unexpected reckoning. The stories of the German women who had refused freedom circulated through command channels and humanitarian committees. What began as a curiosity, an anomaly in the repatriation process, soon took on symbolic weight. For policymakers in Washington, London, and Bonn, it forced a question no one wanted to confront. What if the foundations of peace were as psychologically fragile as the people who had survived the war itself? By then, post-war Germany was an open wound. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden lay in skeletal ruin. Cologne was little more than rubble stitched together with black market hope. The women who had been sent home found no real home at all. Many lived in abandoned barracks or cellars, trading ration cards for coal, paper, or a night's shelter. Those who returned to the Soviet zone faced interrogations, forced labor, or worse. The fear they'd carried across the Atlantic had proven justified. Some were imprisoned again, this time not as soldiers of a defeated Reich, but as witnesses of its fall. When the first sociological studies of post-war trauma appeared, American observers began connecting the dots. Freedom, they realized, is not simply the absence of captivity. It demands identity, purpose, and safety. The women had lost all three. For them, captivity had offered predictability, even dignity. It had been structured, fair, and, unlike the world outside, moral in its consistency. Now, stripped of that fragile order, they drifted in the ruins of a country that no longer recognized them. In the Western zones, U.S. occupation authorities tried to ease that collapse through structure. Programs of re-education and democratization replaced militarism with civic order. Libraries reopened, new newspapers appeared, and quietly, women who had once been POWs began to emerge as typists, translators, and clerks within the new administrative system. They brought with them discipline, literacy, and efficiency, skills learned first in the Wehrmacht, then refined under American oversight. Ironically, their very captivity had trained them for the rebirth of the state they had once served in war. Some of them joined the American-sponsored Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who cleared cities brick by brick, rebuilding foundations by hand. Photographs from 1947 show young faces smeared with soot and dust, yet alive with determination. In their silence and labor, one could see the slow healing of a nation. And within that reconstruction lay the faint echo of the POW camps: order, purpose, and the reassurance of structure. For the first time, they were shaping their own environment, not simply obeying it. Yet the psychological scar remained. The U.S. strategic bombing. Survey's Psychological Annex, an obscure but revealing document, recorded testimonies of German civilians describing a spiritual void. The collapse of authority had stripped away certainty itself. For those who had found protection under American captivity, freedom without guidance felt like falling into an abyss. Some adapted, others withdrew into silence. Postwar psychiatrists called it disorientation syndrome. Soldiers called it something simpler: they lost the map. Meanwhile, American officers who had witnessed the women's pleas found themselves haunted by memory. A few wrote memoirs that appeared decades later, long after their reports had vanished into archives. One captain, recalling the moment he opened the gates of Fort Oglethorpe, wrote, "They looked at me as though I were pushing them off a cliff." His words carried no bitterness, only the strange empathy, born from shared exhaustion. Those accounts reached academics and policymakers during the early Cold War, when the West was searching for ways to stabilize Europe's psyche as much as its economy. The Marshall Plan would pour billions into infrastructure, but what truly rebuilt Germany was discipline. The same trait that had once terrified the world, now redirected toward peace. Many of the women who had once begged to remain prisoners became quiet participants in that transformation. They worked in hospitals, schools, municipal offices, and aid centers. Their efficiency impressed American supervisors. Their obedience reassured German officials trying to restore authority without tyranny. In time, the plea of the POW women faded from headlines but lingered in memory. It resurfaced in post-war literature and psychology as a metaphor for the trauma of identity collapse. To historians, it became a symbol of moral dislocation, the moment when the defeated discovered that even freedom requires courage. For the women themselves, it was simply survival. They had lived between two systems, each claiming righteousness, and found that both demanded surrender of the self. By the 1950s, as West Germany rose from ruin into an economic miracle, a few of those former captives were interviewed again. Some had built new lives, their accents softened by years of contact with Americans. When asked if they regretted leaving the camps, they often smiled faintly and changed the subject. One woman, once a nurse in a Luftwaffe field hospital, answered with careful words, "Freedom is not about walls. It's about who guards your tomorrow." That line would later appear, slightly paraphrased, in a 1961 documentary about the rebuilding of Europe. It was cited as anonymous, but the phrase captured everything the phenomenon represented: the human need for security, even at the expense of liberty. Historians today interpret the women's plea through multiple lenses: trauma, gender, power, and identity. But beyond theory lies the human truth. War had dismantled their world so completely that captivity became the only structure left. The Americans who witnessed it understood something profound: that even the victors could not escape the war's moral cost. In military academies decades later, this story became a footnote in lectures on occupation psychology. Cadets studied it not as sentiment, but as strategy, the understanding that the mind can crave structure more than freedom, and that victory without compassion breeds future instability. As Europe rebuilt, that lesson quietly shaped policy. American advisors in Korea, Vietnam, and even Iraq would echo the same realization: winning the war is easy. Managing the peace is the true battle. And though the names of those German women are mostly forgotten, their desperate refusal to leave became a silent warning that echoed through generations of military planners and humanitarian reformers alike. Near the end of his life, One of the U.S. officers who had overseen the camps returned to Germany as a tourist. He visited the small clearing where Fort Oglethorpe once stood, now just grass and wind. Standing there, he recalled the moment when frightened faces had looked to him as their last hope. "We thought we'd taught them democracy," he later wrote in a letter. "But perhaps they were teaching us something deeper." The plea of the POW women remains one of World War II's most paradoxical legacies. It was not a story of politics or ideology, but of human frailty and resilience, the collision between order and freedom, guilt and grace. These women, once labeled enemies, had revealed a truth that transcended nations, that liberty means little without safety, and peace means nothing without belonging. And so, in the long shadow of history, their whisper still endures, soft, uncertain, and unforgettable. "I was freer here than I'll ever be again."